Welcome back, Highlanders, to part 3 of Chapter 3 on market equilibrium. This is what we've been working towards all chapter. In part 1 of this chapter, we talked about the law of demand and how that relates to the demand curve, the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand, and then shifters of demand. In part 2 of this chapter, we talked about the law of supply and how that relates to the supply curve, the difference between a change in quantity supplied and supply, and then shifters of supply. And then we finished off that part by talking a little bit about elasticity. So here in part 3, we're going to put demand and supply together and create what we call a market equilibrium. And a market equilibrium is a state in which the conflicting forces of supply and demand are in balance. And what I mean by that is that we as buyers, we prefer to buy things at lower prices. The lower the price, the better. But whenever we're selling something, we prefer to sell things at higher prices. The higher the price, the better. So you got buyers who are constantly wanting those low prices. You got sellers who are constantly wanting to sell things at high prices. So these two conflicting forces are going to butt up against each other, and they're going to find a particular point where they are in harmony, and that point is called market equilibrium. And this occurs where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. So with that in mind, this is where we find a perfect balance between buyers and sellers. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that's going to look like on the graph. So again, I've got a chart up here that tells you how much people are willing to buy at certain prices and how much people are willing to produce at certain prices. This is the first time that we've had both how much people are willing to buy and how much people are willing to produce in the same chart, because this is the first time that we're going to have both supply and demand on the same graph. So let's go ahead and draw that graph nice and big. So we got a vertical axis, we got a horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, this is where we put that P for price. On the horizontal axis, this is where we put that Q for quantity. Now let's go ahead and start charting out these points here. Right? So at a price of $6, we know that people want about 50 of this product, or that's how much they're willing to buy at that price. We also know at a price of $4, people are willing to buy 100 units at that price. And at a price of $2, people are willing to buy 150 units at that particular price. So true to the law of demand, as the price goes down, people are willing to buy more, or again at higher prices, people want to buy less. That's not an unusual result, right? Again, that's kind of how the law of demand works. Again, we like to buy things at lower prices. The lower the price, the better, the more we're going to buy. So you connect those dots, and we have that very downward sloping demand curve, right? Now, we also know that when it comes to the law of supply, sellers like to sell things at higher prices. So if they're only going to get $2 for selling the good, they might only be willing to produce and sell 50 of them. If they're only going to get $4 for selling the good, they might be willing to produce and sell 100 of them. But if they're going to get $6 for producing and selling the good, then we know that they're going to be willing to produce and sell 150 of them based off of that chart. So again, we connect these dots, and we have a very upward sloping supply curve. If you miss a dot, just make the dot bigger. Have a way to cheat it a little. All right, and as you can see, there is a point there where these two curves intersect, and that point is at 100 units. That is where we have what's called our equilibrium quantity, which we abbreviate as Q star. That is where the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And then we have an equilibrium price of $4, which we denote with a P star. Right, meaning that at a price of $4, you have 100 people willing to buy this good, and again, at a price of $4, you have 100 of this good being supplied, and that's what we call the market equilibrium. The exact amount of people who want the good is equal to the exact amount of that good being offered for sale at that equilibrium price. So a couple of things to note about this market equilibrium. If you notice this demand curve, this represents how much the buyers value stuff. The supply curve kind of represents the cost to the sellers of producing it. Notice that anywhere between 0 here at the beginning all the way up till Q star, the demand curve is higher than the supply curve, right? So demand is higher than supply, meaning that the benefits to the buyer outweigh the cost to the seller. Once we get past Q star, though, the supply curve is higher than the demand curve, which means, again, that the cost to the seller outweigh the benefits to the buyer. Those are transactions that won't happen. So all the transactions that will happen are those transactions up to and including that market equilibrium where the benefits outweigh the costs. So that's kind of the hallmark of economic efficiency, if you remember from Chapter 1, is doing those things where the benefits outweigh the costs and not doing those things where the costs outweigh the benefits. So the market equilibrium is economically efficient in the sense that there is no excess supply or excess demand. Now, excess supply is whenever quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, meaning that there are more goods being offered for sale than people who want to buy goods at this particular price. And then excess demand is whenever quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, or again, there is more people out there wanting to buy goods than there are goods being offered for sale. So with that in mind, let's take a look at when that might happen. If we have a price that is too high, we're going to do this in red. So if you have a price up here, call this PH, so that's P, superscript H just represents a price that is too high. So let's say that the price is $6. Well, at this price of $6, where that hits that demand curve, remember that gives us the quantity demanded at that price. So that's going to be our quantity demanded here. And where that same price hits the supply curve, that's going to give us the quantity supplied at that price. So this is going to be our quantity supplied here. Notice that we now have 150 goods that are being offered for sale at a price of $6, but only 50 people want to buy these goods being offered at a price of $6. So with that in mind, you have what is known as that excess supply. And you can even calculate what that excess supply is, right? You have 150 goods offered for sale, but only 50 people lining up to buy them. So you have 100 goods sitting there on the shelves that nobody wants to buy. So with that in mind, if you got 100 goods sitting on the shelves and nobody wants to buy, and you're out there managing or running the store, what might you do to the price of these goods? Well, it's no good to have them sitting there without anybody buying them. So eventually you're probably going to lower this price, maybe start to put those goods on sale. Well, we know that as price goes down, that is an increase, not in demand or a shift of the curve, but in quantity demanded, a movement along the curve. At these lower prices, more people are going to be willing to go out there and buy these goods. So if you keep lowering the price, people are going to keep wanting to buy more and more. At the same time, sellers are not as eager to produce and sell these goods when that price is going down. So you have a decrease, not in supply, which is a shift of the curve, but in quantity supplied, which is a movement along the curve, again, until you get to that equilibrium point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. In this particular graph, that occurs at a price of $4. So this excess supply that exists when price is too high won't exist very long in an unregulated market because there's a tendency for that price to drop or for the market mechanism to push price down, which will increase quantity demanded and reduce quantity supplied until they are equal. Now, what happens if there's a price that is too low? We're going to do this in blue. So we got P subscript L is just my representation for a price that is lower than the equilibrium price. Let's say a price of $2. Well, if that's the case, then where that price hits the supply curve, this represents our quantity supplied. And where that same price hits the demand curve, this represents our quantity demanded. Notice now that we have a situation where we have 150 people out there wanting this good, but you only have 50 of this good being supplied. So that is a situation known as our excess demand. You got more people lined up for the good than there are goods available. You might have seen this at the grocery stores recently when it comes to toilet paper, hand sanitizer, milk, eggs, or products that people desperately want. Right, you got more people out there lined up to buy it than there are goods on the shelves. Now, again, in a free and unregulated market, there's a tendency for the market mechanism when this happens to push price up. And that makes sense if you're running the store and you see these goods flying off the shelves and people just lined up for them, and you don't to the point where you just can't keep them in the store. then you might have a tendency to raise the price. Now, as you raise the price, like we talked about in the market for eggs in part 2 of this video, that's going to encourage producers to go out there and produce more of this stuff. That's an increase not in supply, but in quantity supplied, or again, a movement towards that equilibrium on that very same supply curve, right? And at the same time that you're encouraging producers to go out there and make more, you're also encouraging buyers to buy less. They don't like buying things at these higher prices, so that's going to be a reduction, not in demand, but in quantity demanded. You're going to move along that demand curve towards that equilibrium. So again, there's a tendency for the market to push prices up when they're too low, and that's going to increase quantity supplied. It's going to reduce quantity demanded until they are equal, right? And so again, we always end up at that market equilibrium where quantity demand is equal to quantity supplied. And again, we have an equilibrium price that encourages people to produce the exact amount that people want to buy at that price. Which is why, for the most part, when we're not in a pandemic, but just under normal circumstances, when you go to a store, whatever goods you're looking for, the store tends to have them. At the same time, they tend to not have a bunch of goods rotting on shelves that nobody wants. You usually have the right amount of goods at the stores at the right times, and it happens through this market process, right? All right, so with that in mind, that's what this market equilibrium looks like. Again, there's no excess supply or no excess demand in this particular market. All right, as long as the market remains unregulated and free to operate, that is usually the case. So let's talk a little bit about how these curves shift once we're in market equilibrium and what that does to the price, the equilibrium price and quantity of these goods. So when demand changes, both price and quantity move in the same direction as demand. And what I mean by that, as an example, if demand increases, both price and quantity will increase with it. If demand were to decrease, both price and quantity would decrease with it. And that should make sense intuitively. Remember, demand is kind of our desire for having these particular goods. If our desire to buy it increases, then we're going to be willing to pay a higher price for it, so price will go up, and we're going to be willing to buy more of it, so the quantity that is being bought and sold will increase as well. If demand were to decrease or our desire to have this were to go down, then it's, of course, pretty natural to think that price would go down in the sense that we're willing to pay less for it, and that the quantity that we're going to buy that's going to be bought and sold will also go down as we want it less. So you can think through that intuitively, or you can memorize it, or if you don't want to think through it intuitively or memorize it, then the graph usually tells us the right answer. So as I like to say, when in doubt, graph it out. So let's go ahead and draw this graph and talk about what happens when demand changes. So you're going to want to start off in market equilibrium. So if you're following along at home on your notes, go and draw another graph with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. So you'll have a downward sloping demand curve looking something like this. We'll have an upward sloping supply curve looking something like this. And then where the two intersect, that's going to give us our equilibrium quantity, Q star. We're going to call that Q star 1. And P star, or again, we'll go ahead and call that P star 1. We'll go ahead and call this D1, representing our original demand curve. So again, what happens if demand increases? Well, if you remember from the part 1 video, an increase in demand is a shift to the right of that demand curve. Remember, all increases are movements or shifts to the right because we read graphs from left to right. So again, if we shift this demand curve to the right, it's going to look something like that. And where this new demand curve intersects the old supply curve, that's going to give us a new market equilibrium. So we'll call this Q2 star and P2 star. So as I mentioned earlier, when demand goes up or shifts to the right, you're going to see an increase in both quantity and price. They both move in the same direction as demand. Now you can either memorize that they both move in the same direction as demand, or again, you can think through it intuitively. If our desire to have it increases, then we'll be willing to buy more of it, and we'll be willing to pay a higher price for it. Or again, if you can't memorize it or think through it intuitively, just draw the graph. The only thing you have to remember is that an increase is a shift to the right, and the graph will tell you what happens to price and quantity. As you can see from the graph, they both increase. All right, so you can do it any of those three ways. It's a multiple choice exam, so whichever way gets you there, right? That's fine for me. So let's go ahead and talk about what happens when demand decreases. Hopefully, again, you remember from our part 1 of chapter 3 lecture video, that a decrease in demand is a shift to the left of the demand curve. So it might look something like that. We're going to call this D3. And where that third demand curve intersects that supply curve, that's going to give us a new market equilibrium, which we'll call Q3 star. And P3 star. I accidentally moved the axis. I'm not sure how I did that. But in any case, when demand were to go down, as mentioned earlier, again, quantity goes down, price goes down. They both move in the same direction as demand. Again, you can memorize that they both move in the same direction as demand, or think through it intuitively. Again, if people want something less or the desire to have something decreases, then we're going to be willing to buy less of it and pay less for it. Or again, when in doubt, graph it out. Again, the graph will always tell you, as long as you remember that decrease is a shift to the left, then we can sit here and look at the graph showing us that quantity is going to go down and price is going to go down. So that's what happens when demand shifts. As you can imagine, I think you probably recognize that what we're going to talk about next is what happens when supply changes. So when supply changes, price moves in the opposite direction of supply, but quantity still moves in the same direction. So for example, if supply increases, quantity is going to increase with it or move in that same direction, but price is going to decrease and move in that opposite direction. It works in the other way as well. If supply were to decrease, quantity would decrease with it, but price would move in the opposite direction and increase. And again, this should make sense if you're thinking through it intuitively. If supply increases, that means that we're making more of something. If we make more of something, then it makes sense that quantity is going to increase as well. So there's going to be more out there to be bought and sold. But again, if there's more out there to be bought and sold, then these items are less rare. Because they're less rare, it makes sense that price will go down. Or again, it should make sense that if supply were to decrease, so we're not producing as much of this, then there's going to be less out there to be bought and sold, so quantity would decrease, but that would make them more rare, so price would go up, or again, move in the opposite direction of supply. But once again, if you can't think through it intuitively, or if you can't memorize it, then when in doubt, graph it out. Let's go ahead and draw another graph and talk about what happens when that supply curve shifts. So once again, draw a market equilibrium. We'll be doing a lot of these this chapter. So we got price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. Got an upward sloping supply curve, because again, people like to produce and sell more at higher prices. You got a downward sloping demand curve, because again, people like to buy more at lower prices. And there's that point where those two curves intersect, where those two conflicting forces are in perfect harmony. Again, we'll call that equilibrium quantity, or Q star 1, and equilibrium price, P star 1. I'll go ahead and call this S1 because we're going to put some other supply curves on this graph. So let's say that one of those shifters of supply happens. Let's say that the price of the resource used to produce this good goes down so that it's cheaper to make, so we're going to make more of it. Right? Again, an increase in supply, the only thing you really have to remember is that's going to be a shift to the right of the supply curve. We'll call that S2. And where that intersects that old demand curve, that's going to give us a new market equilibrium, which is going to give us a new equilibrium quantity, call that Q2 star, and a new equilibrium price that we're going to call P2 star, right? So again, when supply goes up, it stands to reason, or it should make sense intuitively, that as we're producing more of it, there's going to be more of it being bought and sold, so equilibrium quantity is going to go up. But because there's more out there, they're less rare, and therefore the price is going to go down. Right? Again, if you can't think through that intuitively, you can memorize quantity always moves in the same direction and price always moves in the opposite direction. If you can't do that either, then when in doubt, graph it out. Again, the graph shows us that quantity increases and price decreases when supply increases or shifts to the right. Now, if the price of a resource or ingredient used to produce that good increases, so it's now more expensive to make it, then that's going to shift that supply curve to the left, or decrease supply, which is going to look something like this. So we'll call that S3. And where that third supply curve intersects our old demand curve, that's going to again give us a new equilibrium with a new equilibrium quantity, which we'll call Q3 star, and a new equilibrium price, which we will call P3 star. And again, as explained earlier, when supply goes down or shifts to the left, again, that means that we're producing less of it, so there's less out there that can be bought and sold. So that means that quantity is going to go down because there's less of it out there. It's more rare. So as you might expect, the price of it is going to go up. Right? Again, if you can't think that intuitively, you can memorize quantity moves in the same direction as supply, while price moves in the opposite direction. If you can't do that either, then when in doubt, graph it out. Once again, the graph will always tell us the answer. A decrease in supply causes quantity to go down and price to go up. Again, as long as you can remember that a decrease in supply is a shift to the left, the graph will tell you what happens. Right? So remember, you are allowed a blank piece of scratched paper and something to write with for your exams. If it helps you to draw out the graph and shift these curves in order to figure out what happens to price and quantity, then please feel free to do so. So that's what happens when supply changes. So we've talked about what happens when demand shifts, what happens when supply shifts. That's kind of the easy part. Let's get a little bit crazy. Let's get a little bit nuts. Let's talk about what happens if both change at the same time. All right, this is where things get a little bit more intense. It might be a little scary for some people, but don't worry, it's really not that complicated. We're going to go through an example of how this works. So, moving forward here, let's say that the coronavirus outbreak has caused people to prefer to drink more antioxidant green tea. At the same time, social distancing measures that has been created in response to the coronavirus has made antioxidant green tea more expensive to produce. What will happen to the equilibrium price and quantity of antioxidant green tea, given that both of these changes are occurring at the same time? So again, let's go ahead and graph this out. So let's draw another graph here. Another market equilibrium. So we got price on the vertical axis. We got quantity on the horizontal axis. We're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. You're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. And where the two intersect, that's going to give us our equilibrium quantity. We'll call that Q star 1 and P star 1. And this is going to be our original demand and supply curve. All right. So whenever you see these what I call double shift questions where two changes are happening at the same time, then you always want to isolate each statement. So take it one statement at a time. So the first statement says that the coronavirus outbreak has caused people to prefer to drink more antioxidant green tea. Right. So looking at this first statement, ask yourself this question: is this something that's going to affect demand, or is this something that's going to affect supply? So think back to your shifters of demand and your shifters of supply. This looks like a change in consumer tastes and preferences to me, which is definitely something that's going to shift that demand curve. So now that you figured out that's going to affect demand, is this going to make demand go up or down? Well, it looks like people prefer to drink something more. It's going to be an increase in demand. So that's going to be a shift to the right of the demand curve. So we'll call that D2. Remember that whenever demand increases, that's going to cause that equilibrium quantity to go up. And we can see that from the graph where it intersects that old supply curve. We have this increase in demand and this increase in price, where they both change in the same direction as demand, right? So when demand goes up, we know that quantity goes up and price goes up, or they both move in the same direction as demand. We can see that from the graph. Now, let's take a look at the second statement. So the second statement says, at the same time, social distancing measures created in response to the coronavirus has made this antioxidant green tea more expensive to produce. So isolating down to the second statement, again, think, is this going to be a demand shift or a supply shift? Well, we're talking about producing green tea here. In other words, the cost of producing it has gone up in response to this change in nature and or politics that we mentioned in part 2 of this chapter in that video. So again, it looks like this is going to decrease supply. So it's definitely a supply shift and one that's going to make supply go down. And remember, a decrease in supply is a shift to the left of the supply curve. So if we're drawing that graph out, it'll look something like this. We'll go ahead and call this S3, even though it's only the second supply curve on the graph, just to distinguish it from that second demand curve. And where that intersects D2, or our newest demand curve, this gives us a new equilibrium quantity, which we'll call Q3 star, and a new equilibrium price, which we will call P3 star. And again, as we can see, when supply goes down, that's going to make our quantity go down and our price go up. So when you look at these two changes, I want you to notice that when we're talking about demand increasing, that's going to make quantity go up. That is a movement to the right on that horizontal axis. But then also, as our supply is decreasing, then that's going to make our quantity go down or move to the left along that horizontal axis. But when demand goes up, that's going to make price go up, which goes up on the vertical axis. And then when supply goes down, that also makes price go up. So we're still going up on the vertical axis. So if we're to combine these changes, we use purple since we're combining blue and red numbers here. But when we're combining these changes, it looks like in both cases, when demand goes up and supply goes down, then both cases it makes price go up. So what we know is going to happen to antioxidant green tea without a doubt during this coronavirus outbreak is that the price is going to increase. So the price is going to be higher because it's going up in both cases. However, when demand goes up, that makes quantity go up. When supply goes down, that makes quantity go down. So what's going to happen to quantity? Well, it depends on which of those arrows is bigger. Now, the way I drew it in this graph, I drew it so that Q3 ended up to the right of our original quantity, suggesting that the equilibrium quantity might increase or that the demand effect is bigger. But if you're drawing at home, you might have drawn it in such a way that Q3 ended up to the left of Q1, indicating that the supply effect was bigger or that the equilibrium quantity would go down as a result. Or some of you might have drawn it so that Q3 was exactly equal to Q1, indicating that the two effects perfectly offset. The point here is that if I don't tell you which effect is stronger, and I won't, then when you have two arrows moving in opposite directions, the best thing we can say is that the effect on quantity is ambiguous, or you don't know what's going to happen to equilibrium quantity. So sometimes the right answer is, I don't know. So the answer you choose on the exam is that we know equilibrium price will increase as a result of these two effects, but the effect on quantity is going to be ambiguous, right? So again, you're always going to have one where the arrows are moving in opposite direction, and if that is the case, then we say that the effect is ambiguous because I will tell you which arrow is stronger, right? So that's how you do these double shift questions. If you're kind of wondering, hey, these could be kind of complicated or difficult to do, then don't worry. That's what the week 3 discussion session video is all about, giving you a little bit more practice on how to do these, and then that's what your discussion session 3 assignment is all about. So you'll definitely have a lot of time and opportunity to practice these types of questions. But here's kind of the procedure for solving these questions if you want to kind of nail it down to a step-by-step way to make sure you get them correct. So the first step is take it one statement at a time, right? So in other words, if there are two shifts going on, for example, people preferring more green tea at the same time the social distancing causes it to be more expensive to make, then as we did in the last problem, break it down and just look at one statement, the idea that people prefer more at this particular time. And then ask yourself these 3 questions. First of all, does this affect supply or demand? In order to ask yourself this question, then you need to make sure that you understand what the shifters of demand are and what the shifters of supply are. And then ask yourself, does it make it go up or down? In other words, is that supply going up or shifting to the right, or is it going down or shifting to the left? And then finally, what happens to price and quantity? Again, the graph will tell you that answer if you can't think it through intuitively, or if you can't memorize that price and quantity move in the same direction as demand, while quantity moves in the same direction as supply, but price moves in the opposite direction. And then you're going to repeat these steps A, B, and C for the second statement. Again, does it affect supply or demand? Does it make it go up or down? What happens to price and quantity? And then finally, you're going to add the effects together. Again, if the two arrows are moving in the same direction, then you know that price or quantity is moving in that particular direction. If those two arrows are moving in opposite directions, then that price or quantity is ambiguous. All right, so that's the kind of procedure for solving those double shift questions. Again, you will get some more practice with that in your third discussion session activity, which again, we'll go through a video explaining how to do these, and then you'll have an activity where you get to practice on 5 questions that involve these double shift procedures. All right, so let's move on to the last part of Chapter 3, where I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think it is possible for one person completely on their own without any help from anyone else to make a single pencil from scratch? So if you're writing with a pencil right now, take a look at that pencil. Do you think you can make that pencil on your own without any help from anyone else, right? So again, some people might think yes, some people might think no. If you're in my honors class and you have a reading, that will probably convince you that the answer is no, but let's take a look as to why. Right, so could you make this pencil from scratch? My guess is no, you probably couldn't, right? Don't worry about it, I couldn't either. Let's talk about why that's the case. So when you're making a pencil on your own from scratch, right, here are the things that you need, right? First of all, you need the wood for the pencil. As you might have guessed, that comes from trees. Those trees are in Northern California, so you need to go up to Northern California and cut down one of those trees. When you're going up to Northern California, because you have to do this on your own from scratch without any help from anybody else, you're not allowed to use a vehicle made by somebody else. So you can't use a car or plane that somebody else has made, because that's cheating. You got to do it completely on your own. You also can't cut down that tree with an axe unless you produce that axe yourself, meaning that you mined out the iron ore and forged it into steel to create that axe head, and that you're able to again get a piece of wood to attach that axe head to completely on your own without any help. Now, once you've cut down that wood needs to be cut and dried in a kiln. If you don't have a kiln that you have produced completely on your own from scratch, then you need to make that too. And then you need to coat that wood with 6 layers of lacquer. If you don't know how to produce lacquer, well, then you've already lost, right? The game's over. You can't produce that pencil, all right? If you do know how to produce that lacquer, then again, you need to be able to do that completely on your own without any help from anybody else. If you're looking for the graphite, that is mined in Sri Lanka, so you got to go over there. Again, if you're using a boat or plane made by somebody else, you're cheating, so you got to make your own boat or plane from scratch, again, if you want to do this the right way. And then you got to mix that graphite that you mined in Sri Lanka with, again, the tools that you created yourself. You got to mix that with clay from Mississippi, which, again, you've got to get to on your own without any help. And then you've got to coat that with wax from Mexico, which you also have to get to, again, on your own without any help from anybody else. If you're looking to make that brass around the eraser, that is made from combining zinc, copper, and nickel, all of which you're going to have to mine and forge using tools that you've created on your own. And then finally, the eraser is made from combining rapeseed oil from Indonesia, so you're going to need to go over to Indonesia in order to get that. And you need to combine that with sulfur chloride and rubber, and that rubber is made by combining pumice from Italy with cadmium sulfide. So if you're working on your chemistry degree and you know how to do all that, that's great, but you still need to get all those materials, again, without any help from any other person. So could you make this pencil on your own from scratch? My guess is probably not, at least not in the kind of quality of the pencil that you might be writing with right now. And even if you could, it might take you an entire lifetime to do it. But I want you to note that a lot of people from all over the world are working together in perfect harmony to make these pencils so that they end up in your store pretty cheaply, right? Like you can probably buy a box of 20 pencils for $1. That comes out to 5 cents a pencil. Now that you see all the procedures that go into making this pencil, it's pretty much a miracle or pretty amazing that those pencils end up into your store cheap, right? For that, at least in a way in which they're that inexpensive. And that gets us to this process called the invisible hand principle, which is a philosophical concept invented by Adam Smith, who is the founder of modern economics. He wrote this book back in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations, and that kind of started our formal study of what we know today as economics, and he's kind of the reason why you have to take these economics classes. Well, in that book, The Wealth of Nations, he talks about this concept of an invisible hand, which is the tendency for people, while pursuing their own self-interest, to promote the economic well-being of society. And basically what he's saying here is that the people around the world who are working really hard to put pencils into your store for as cheaply as possible, they probably don't really care about you or your ability to get pencils. In fact, probably don't care about pencils at all. A lot of them probably can't even read or write, but they're still going to work really hard to get the ingredients together to make sure that those pencils end up in your store. Again, not because they care about you, but because they care about making money for themselves. But in pursuing their own interests, they're actually going to work together in order to make sure that you can get the pencils that you need at the exact times that you need them. Right? Again, if you're in the honors class, that is part of your first assigned reading, I Pencil by Leonard Reed. If you're not in the honors class, that assigned reading is still posted up there on iLearn, right, in that essay folder for the honors students, so you can check it out if you are interested. But the idea here is that, again, a lot of people work really hard around the world to put pencils into your store in just the right quantities at just the right times without even realizing that they're doing it, because, again, they're only looking out for their own self-interest, but in doing so, creating that economic harmony or equilibrium for everybody else. For example, you might notice that during certain times of years, for example, like when kids are getting ready to go back to school after summer vacation, then there's an increase in the demand for pencils during that time. So if you go to the store, you're going to see that the price of pencils has gone up, and people are going to be out there buying more pencils at this time in response to this, again, increase in the preference for pencils as kids go back to school. Well, it's amazing that people around the world are going to work extra hard to make sure that more pencils get into the store at this time. Not because they care about, again, these kids having these pencils for school, but they know that they get paid a little bit more for their work during this time. They get paid a little bit more for their rapeseed oil, their cadmium sulfide, their lacquer, their lumber, right? Because, again, the demand for pencils are higher. That makes the price of pencils go up, so they get paid a little bit more for their effort. They're going to work extra hard or produce more to put those pencils in your store during this time period, right? So again, that is the invisible hand principle. And again, it's just kind of this idea that there's a tendency for us to work together and promote the economic well-being of society without really intending to do so. We're just really pursuing our own self-interest, right? So the way this works, again, is I want you to think about any job that you've had in your life. Like if you've had a job waiting tables, then I want you to go back and think about what your real desires were when you were waiting tables for somebody. Did you care about maximizing their your customer satisfaction to have a great meal, or did you care about maximizing your tips? Right? You might not really have cared about your customers at all, but if you cared about maximizing your tips, you had to at least pretend like you cared about your customers. You had to make sure they had a great meal. You had to get them their food quickly, make sure that their orders are right, and that they had a great dining experience. Right? That's how you're going to get the greatest tips possible, which is good for you. But again, you treating your customers in that way is good for the customers and good for the restaurant owner. So again, you're going to work really hard to make sure your customers have a great meal, even if you don't necessarily care about your customers, but you just care about maximizing the tips for yourself, right? But in caring about maximizing the tips for yourself, you're going to do what's in the best interest of your customers and the restaurant owner. That's kind of how the invisible hand principle works. And that's what gets all these goods into the market at the right time, what helps us get to that equilibrium quantity. Right, so that's it for this chapter. Here's a quick review. Know why the supply curve is upward sloping and why the demand curve is downward sloping. Right, remember the supply curve is upward sloping because as price goes up, people are more eager to produce and sell goods or put them in the market. The demand curve is downward sloping because as price goes up, people are less willing to buy the good at that higher price. Again, that inverse or negative relationship results in a downward sloping curve. Now, these shifters of demand that we talked about, remember there's a change in income, there's a change in the number of consumers, there's a change in the price of a related good, there's a change in expectations, and then a change in consumer tastes and preferences. I'm not going to ask you to memorize those or to write them all out, but do know, again, what happens to the demand for cereal if the price of milk changes, or what happens to the demand for an inferior good if your income goes down. Now, these shifters of supply, we talked about 4 of those. Those are a change in the price of a resource or ingredient used to produce the good, a change in technology, a change in nature and or politics, and then the 4th one was a change in taxes. Again, I'm never going to ask you to list those out, but know what happens to supply when taxes go up, or know what happens to supply if our technology were to decrease in some kind of way. And then 4 is understand the characteristics of market equilibrium. Remember that all the goods where the benefits outweigh the costs are being produced. None of the goods where the costs outweigh the benefits are being produced. And there's no excess supply or excess demand in market equilibrium. Be able to do the single and double shifts of demand and supply curves. Again, we have a discussion session activity for week 3 that is going to be all about those double shift questions to give you more practice with that. And then finally, make sure you know and understand the invisible hand principle, which says that through the pursuit of our own self-interest, we tend to promote the economic welfare or benefit of society. Again, that's Adam Smith's idea way back from 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations. So that is it for Chapter 3. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter on supply and demand. I know it's more of a graphically intense one. If you have any questions about these graphs, again, please feel free to let me know. You can shoot me that email or come visit me in my office hours through Zoom. Now, that is also the end of our basic economics section of this course. So the next chapter, we're going to skip ahead in the textbook to Chapter 7, which is core macroeconomics. And so if you have taken ECON3, then these first 3 chapters have been largely a review. Chapter 7 is where it's going to get new for you for the first time. If you haven't had ECON3, don't worry about it. We've gone over these first 3 chapters in the kind of detail I expect you to know, so you should be all caught up. And again, Chapter 7, just like for everybody else, will be new for you as well. But that's it so far. Again, let me know if you need anything. I hope you all are having a good one. Again, let me give me any feedback on the class or how I can make it better. And until our next video, take care, stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you all next time.